I think those disturbing Manson updates, might help set the tone for what's coming, because this could possibly be the darkest episode I've ever done. We're going to be venturing into true crime territory. And it's funny, as much as I'm drawn to morbid stuff like horror movies, dark fiction like the works of H.P. Lovecraft, dark music like that of Marilyn Manson, etc., I find true crime, real life stories of serial killers, etc., especially if it involves, people harming children or animals, to just be really disturbing and depressing. But back in the day, I used to be a real documentary junkie. I especially like documentaries on ancient history, religion, that kind of thing. But sometimes I would find myself watching these true crime documentary series like Investigative Reports with Bill Curtis on A&E or whatever. And anyone remember, if you're old enough, how like 20 years ago or so, it seemed like everything was narrated by Bill Curtis at one point? Um, but there were a couple of cases that just really stuck with me because of how disturbing they were. And I recently mentioned how I had binge watched season one of the popular anime Attack on Titan. And this is what happens when you don't get married. You end up watching cartoons and collecting werewolves. But anyway, self deprecating humor. Since then, I've gone on to binge watch the rest of the series. So I'm now all caught up and waiting for the second half of season four, the final season, to drop. But in a certain episode, I think it's specifically episode 15 of season 1, they mention in the same breath the names of the two different killers whose cases disturbed me so much back in the day, so pretty wild. And so, for those who aren't familiar, the basic premise of Attack on Titan is that there's this relatively small human civilization living within or behind a series of concentric walls, and as far as they know, they're all that's left of humanity. And I believe there's also a kind of class structure based on which wall you live behind. The ones living behind the outermost wall are seen as the most expendable, while the aristocracy and the elite live within the innermost circle, or so I think, something to that effect. And so I believe within the story, people know that Titans exist, but there's been 100 years of relative peace without any Titans managing to get inside the walls. And then one day the shit hits the fan, and a couple of exceptionally large and powerful Titans, who basically look like giant skinless humans, suddenly appear and breach the walls, and then smaller Titans come pouring in behind them and begin devouring the human inhabitants. And so there's basically two types of Titans. There's the ones that possess human intelligence, like the ones that attack the walls. I could elaborate more on the nature of these Titans, but I don't want to give too much away. And then there's others, usually smaller and much greater in number, who are essentially mindless and capable of being reasoned with and driven only by an instinctual desire to consume human flesh, which is kind of what makes them so damn creepy and terrifying. And so, given the context, I think it makes sense that there would be little Easter eggs or fleeting references to actual real world cannibals. And I probably should have mentioned that earlier. Those two cases that really stuck with me that I keep alluding to, they both concern men who were not only serial killers, as if that wasn't bad enough, but who were also cannibals to boot. For some reason, the way I just said boot made me feel really Canadian. Anyway, I'm getting there, bear with me. So in episode 15, there's a female character, Hanji, I believe, what a nerd I am, who's a scientist of sorts who gets a little too excited or enthusiastic when it comes to researching Titans, and she kind of provides some, comic relief in that sense. But she has a couple of smaller Titans pinned to the ground by ropes and large nails driven through their flesh, and she's trying to think of what name she should give them. And there's a couple of soldiers standing nearby, and this brief exchange ensues.
We gotta go through this again? Her naming scheme is so weird.
Yeah, what did she end up going with last time?
It was Chicatilo and Albert.
And so I presume it's gotta be Andre Chicatilo and Albert Fish, two notorious cannibal serial killers. And so they're the two whose stories really disturbed me back in the day and that have just kind of stuck with me over the years. Now, other than the fact that they were both absolute monsters who killed and cannibalized other human beings, these guys have nothing to do with each other. These are two separate cases. But before we take a closer look at those two, I wanted to briefly acknowledge that in the same scene, the Hanji character goes on to mention another cannibal serial killer, and that's where she gets the names for her two new test subjects.
In honor of the cannibal tribe's notorious leader, I'm going to christen you beauties accordingly. You'll be Sonny. You are Bean. No need to fret, though. I'm not going to publicly disembowel you or burn you at the stake. Pleasure to meet you, Sonny. Likewise, Bean.
And so I have to admit, to my embarrassment, as much as I love history, I had no idea what she was referencing. And so I quickly Googled Sonny and Bean and discovered that there was this legendary or pseudo-historical, I think the jury's still out, cannibal clan leader in 16th century Scotland by the name of Sonny Bean. And I know there's a whole bunch of people with sticks up their butts who don't like when podcasters, resort to Wikipedia. If this was one of my official documentary episodes, I'd do a lot more digging, but we're just having kind of fun and riffing on serial killers here. So I'm gonna read from Wikipedia. Alexander, quote-unquote, Sonny Bean, was said to be the head of a 45-member clan in Scotland in the 16th century that murdered and cannibalized over 1,000 people in the span of 25 years. According to legend, Bean and his clan members would eventually be caught by a search party sent by King James VI and were executed for their heinous crimes. The story appeared in the Newgate Calendar, a crime catalogue of Newgate Prison in London. The legend lacks sufficient evidence to be deemed true by historians, and there is debate as to why the legend would have been fictionalized. Nevertheless, the myth of Sonny Bean has passed into local folklore and has become a part of the Edinburgh tourism circuit. According to the Newgate Calendar, a tabloid publication from the 18th and 19th centuries, Alexander Bean was born in East Lothian, I think it is, during the 16th century. His father was a ditch digger and hedge trimmer, and Bean tried to take up the family trade, but quickly realized that he was not fit for the work. He left home with an allegedly vicious woman named Black Agnes Douglas, who apparently shared his inclinations and was accused of being a witch. After some robbing and the cannibalization of one of their victims, the couple ended up at Coastal Cave in Benane Head, I think, between Girvan and Ballantrae, all these Scottish place names. The cave was 200 yards deep, and the entrance was blocked by water during high tide, so the couple were able to live there undiscovered for some 25 years. Sonny and Agnes produced 8 sons, 6 daughters, 18 grandsons, and 14 granddaughters. Various grandchildren were products of incest between their children. Lacking the inclination for regular labor, the Bean clan thrived by laying careful ambushes at night to rob and murder individuals or small groups. The clan brought the bodies back to their cave where the corpses were dismembered and eaten. They pickled the leftovers in barrels. The clan discarded body parts, which would sometimes wash up on nearby beaches. This strategy was used to help conceal their crimes and lead villagers to believe that it was animals who were attacking travelers. The body parts and disappearances did not go unnoticed by the local villagers, but the Bean clan stayed in their cave by day and took their victims at night. The Bean clan was so clandestine that the villagers were unaware of the murderers living nearby. But according to the story, they were eventually caught, and I think there's a couple of different versions. Let's see. The most common of the two is that the Bean clan was captured alive, where they gave up without a fight. They were taken in chains to the Tolbooth jail in Edinburgh, then transferred to Leith or Glasgow, where they were promptly executed without trial as people saw them as subhuman and unfit for one. Sonny and his fellow men had their genitalia cut off and thrown into the fires, their hands and feet severed, and were allowed to bleed to death. With Sonny shouting his dying words, It isn't over. It will never be over. That's such like a movie thing. I can picture that in like some horror movie. And after watching the men die, Agnes, her fellow women, and the children were tied to stakes and burned alive. These execution practices recall in essence, if not in detail, the punishments of hanging, drawing, and quartering decreed for men convicted of treason. In contrast, women convicted of the same were burned. There was another claim that the search party placed gunpowder at the entrance of their cave, where the Sonny Bean clan faced the fate of suffocation. And so, as it was implied earlier, the historicity of both Sonny Bean and the story as a whole are a matter of contention. The consensus seems to be that it's largely a legend, but there could be some historical basis. But I'll read a bit more, why not? So let's see, sources and veracity. According to the Scotsman, there is a debate over the validity of the Sonny Bean tale. Some people believe that Sonny Bean was a real person, while others think he was just a mythical figure. Dorothy L. Sayers, I think it is, offered a gruesome account of the Sonny Bean tale in her anthology, Great Short Stories of Detection, Mystery, and Horror. It looks like that book was written or published in 1928. The book was a bestseller in Britain, reprinted 7 times in the next 5 years. A 2005 article by Sean Thomas, whoever the hell that is, notes that historical documents, such as newspapers and diaries during the era in which Sonny Bean was supposedly active, make no mention of ongoing disappearances of hundreds of people. Additionally, Thomas notes inconsistencies in the stories, but speculates that kernels of truth might have inspired the legend. And so I think this is an excerpt or a quote from Broadsheet to Broadsheet, a broadsheet just being a type of newspaper, I believe. The precise dating of Sonny Bean's reign of anthropophagic terror, why is that? That reminds me of those old Italian zombie movies. Wasn't there one of them that had a name like that? Anthropophagic terror varies wildly. Sometimes the atrocities occurred during the reign of James VI, early 1600s, whilst other versions claim the Beans lived centuries before. Viewed in this light, it is arguable that the Bean story may have a basis in truth, but the precise dating of events has become obscured over the years. Perhaps the dating of the murders was brought forward by the editors and writer of the broadsheets, so as to make the story appear more relevant to the readership. To add to the intrigue, we know that cannibalism was not unknown in medieval Scotland, and that Galloway was in medieval times a very lawless place. Perhaps nothing on the scale of the Bean legend took place, but every story grows and is embroidered over time. And so I think that's the end of that particular excerpt, but then it continues. The Sonny Bean legend closely resembles the story of Christy Cleek, which is attested much earlier in the early 15th century. Christy Cleek is a mythical Scottish cannibal who lived during a famine in the mid-14th century. The legend of Sonny Bean first appeared in the British chapbooks, rumor magazines of the day. Today, many argue that the story was a political propaganda tool to denigrate the Scots after the Jacobite rebellions. Thomas disagrees, noting, "If the Sonny Bean story is to be read as deliberately anti-Scottish, how do we explain the equal emphasis on English criminals in the same publications? Wouldn't such an approach rather blunt the point?" Then it continues, another cannibal story from Scotland, even more redolent of the Sonny Bean tale than the Christy Cleek story, can be found in the 1696 work, of Nathaniel Crouch, a compiler and popular history writer who published under the pseudonym Richard Burton. In this tale, the following happened in 1459, the year before James II of Scotland's death, about which time a certain thief who lived privately in a den with his wife and children were all burned alive, they having made it their practice for many years to kill young people and eat them. One girl only of a year old was saved and brought up at Dundee, who at 12 years of age, being found guilty of the same horrid crime, was condemned to the same punishment. And when the people followed her in great multitudes to execution, wondering at her unnatural villainy, she turned toward them and with a cruel countenance said, What do you thus rail at me, as if I had done such a heinous act, contrary to the nature of man? I tell you that if you did but know how pleasant the taste of man's flesh was, none of you all would forbear to eat it. And thus, with an impenitent and stubborn mind, she suffered deserved death. And then it references a medieval historian and philosopher, Hector Boece, I think it is, notes that the infant daughter of a Scot brigand who was executed with his family for cannibalism, though raised by foster parents, developed the cannibal appetite at 12 and was put to death for it. This was summarized by George M. Gould and Walter Pyle in Anomalies and Curiosities of Medicine. And then as a horror fan, I found this pretty interesting. Supposedly, the story of the Bean Clan was at least in part the inspiration for Wes Craven's film The Hills Have Eyes. And I can totally see that. It seems like the template for that, trope we see in all those horror movies where there's some inbred family of cannibalistic hillbillies. The Hills Have Eyes, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Actually, I think Texas Chainsaw Massacre was inspired, at least in part, by the story of Ed Gein, but then you have Wrong Turn and a bunch of other ones. But back to Fish and Chicatilo, this fall on CBS. But seriously, they were two of the most depraved killers that I think the world has ever known. And when you read the nature of their crimes, you almost feel like you need to take a shower to get the grime off of you. Just unspeakable depravity. And I'm not trying to make excuses for their monstrous behavior, there is no excusing it, but I do think it's interesting to note that both Fish and Chicatilo had absolutely horrific childhoods. And so I think their cases might serve as good examples of how quote-unquote nurture, environmental factors or conditions, early childhood experiences, etc., might play a significant role in the making of a serial killer. As I think I've heard experts suggest, in most cases it's probably a combination of nature and nurture. If you have someone who's perhaps genetically predisposed to psychopathy, and then on top of that you subject them to a horrific childhood filled with trauma, abuse, and sadism, you just might end up with a monster. Whereas maybe on the other hand, if you have someone who is maybe wired for psychopathy or a lack of empathy or whatever, but they have a pretty normal, stable upbringing, who knows, maybe they end up working on Wall Street instead of strangling hookers. But then again, there's people like Jeffrey Dahmer who, have pretty normal childhoods, but nevertheless end up turning into serial killers. In a case like that, maybe it's just nature winning out over nurture, who knows? But either way, I would imagine adding a horrific childhood to the mix probably doesn't help things. So I'll start with Chikatilo's background, but before I do, I wanted to quickly mention, I don't know if author Thomas Harris has come out and said as much, but I wouldn't be surprised if Chikatilo's childhood was at least partly the inspiration for Hannibal Lecter's childhood, as depicted in both the book and movie versions of Hannibal Rising. And it's funny, I think Hannibal Rising was absolutely panned by critics, and I'm not sure audiences were crazy about it either, but I loved it, and I'm speaking about the movie version specifically. I don't think I read the book. Actually, I may have listened to the audiobook version. I can't really remember. But if I'm remembering correctly, I believe the people who held the movie rights to the Hannibal Lecter character, I think it may have been De Laurentiis or whatever it is, but they basically informed Thomas Harris, the creator of Hannibal Lecter, the author of the Hannibal Lecter novels, that whether he was in or not, they were going to make an origin film about Hannibal Lecter. And Harris, probably so someone else didn't bastardize the character he created, and maybe for the paycheck too, definitely wouldn't blame him, was like, okay, and he whipped up Hannibal Rising. Like most, I loved Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter, so I was unsure if I'd be receptive to someone else playing the character. And the kid who plays Hannibal in the movie looks nothing like Anthony Hopkins, but I really liked the story, and I thought the kid was a good fit for the role. And I think the fact that he was playing a younger Hannibal made me a little less picky in a way. You can always tell yourself, oh, maybe he looked a little different when he was younger or whatever, But the basic plot is that Hannibal was born into an aristocratic Lithuanian family, loving parents, relatively privileged lifestyle. But because of World War II, the family is forced to flee to their hunting lodge in the woods. The parents die in an explosion, I think. And so it's just Hannibal, who is still pretty small himself, and his little sister. A group of Lithuanian militiamen, Nazi collaborators, I believe, make themselves at home in the family's lodge where Hannibal and his sister are. And these guys are really kind of menacing and rough around the edges. It's really disturbing, but they basically kill and eat Hannibal's little sister. And he doesn't find out till later, but they fed her to him without telling him as well. And we're used to a very cold and calculating Lecter. But as a boy, he's actually a pretty good kid. You know Hannibal Lecter? Good kid. But a good kid, a loving and protective brother. So you can imagine the effect this would have on him. And so this is supposed to be, the formative moment that leads him to becoming a cannibalistic killer. Now, I think one problem some people had with Hannibal Rising is that they preferred letting Hannibal's origins, remain a mystery. They felt like giving him a sympathetic origin story somehow took something away from the character. But me, I'm a sucker for, a good revenge story. And so the rest of the movie is kind of Hannibal, coming of age, becoming a young man, and beginning to systematically hunt down and kill the people who killed and ate his sister. And there's one scene I love near the end of the movie, spoiler alert, but Hannibal forms a pseudo-romantic relationship with his uncle's widow, this Japanese woman. I forget her name. And Hannibal finally tracks down what I think is the last guy on his list, or maybe the second to last of his sister's killers. And he's trying to, and I think he's trying to get the name of the final killer from him. But I think it's here that the guy tells him that he also, Hannibal that is, also unknowingly consumed his sister in the broth they fed him. And this revelation really pushes him over the edge. He starts carving his sister's initial, M for Misha, into the guy. And his aunt tries to stop him, but he chooses revenge, which I thought was the right choice, and starts basically eating the guy's face, I think. But Chicatilo, of course, wasn't some cool anti-hero. He was a child-killing monster, a real-life one. But his early life does have or share some parallels with Lecter's fictional childhood. So I'll read a bit here. Let's see. Once again, Wikipedia. Andrei Romanovich Chicatilo, let's see, was born 1936, died 1994, was a Soviet serial killer, and I have to say, Chicatilo and Albert Fish, as much as I despise them and their deeds, they did have some pretty cool nicknames. So Chicatilo was also known as the Butcher of Rostov and the Red Ripper and the Rostov Ripper. But so it says he sexually assaulted, murdered, and mutilated at least 52 women and children between 1978 and 1990 in the Russian FSSR, the Ukrainian SSR, and the Uzbek SSR. A lot of Soviet alphabet soup there. But Chikatilo confessed to 56 murders, 53 of which he was tried in April 1992. He was convicted and sentenced to death for 52 murders in October 1992, although the Supreme Court of Russia ruled in 1993 that insufficient evidence existed to prove his guilt in 9 of those killings. Chikatilo was subsequently executed in February 1994. Chikatilo, and it's kind of repeating itself here, was known as the Rostov Ripper and the Butcher of Rostov because he committed most of his murders in the Rostov Oblast of the Russian SFSR. And so here's a bit about his early life, and it gets pretty disturbing. So Andrei Chikatilo was born on the 16th of October, 1936, in the village of... I think I've been doing all right with pronunciations, place names, etc. in this episode, but this one, I'm sure I'll butcher it. Yablunkna? Yablokny? I have no idea. But a small village, I guess, in the Sumy Oblast of the Ukrainian SSR. At the time of his birth, Ukraine was in the grip of a famine caused by Joseph Stalin's forced collectivization of agriculture. Chikatilo's parents were both collective farm laborers who lived in a one-room hut. They received no wages for their work, but instead received the right to cultivate a plot of land behind the family hut. The family seldom had sufficient food. Chikatilo himself later claimed not to have eaten bread until the age of 12, adding that he and his family often had to eat grass and leaves in an effort to stave off hunger. Throughout his childhood, Chikatilo was repeatedly told by his mother Anna that prior to his birth, an older brother of his named Stepan, I think it is, or Stepan, had at the age of 4 been kidnapped and cannibalized by starving neighbors, although it has never been established whether this incident actually occurred or if a Stepan Chikatilo even existed. Nonetheless, Chikatilo recalled his childhood as being blighted by poverty, ridicule, hunger, and war. When the Soviet Union entered the Second World War, Chikatilo's father, Roman, was conscripted into the Red Army. He would later be taken prisoner after being wounded in combat. Between 1941 and 1944, Chikatilo witnessed some of the effects of the Nazi occupation of Ukraine, which he described as quote-unquote horrors, adding he witnessed bombings, fires, and shootings, from which he and his mother would hide in cellars and ditches. On one occasion, Chikatilo and his mother were forced to watch their own hut burn to the ground. With his father at war, Chikatilo and his mother shared a single bed. He was a chronic bedwetter, and his mother berated and beat him for each offense. And I think I've heard on numerous occasions, watching true crime documentaries and stuff, that for some reason there's a link between, serial killers and bedwetting as children, or bedwetting and psychopathy. Not quite sure why that is. In 1943, Chikatilo's mother gave birth to a baby girl, Tatiana. Because Chikatilo's father had been conscripted in 1941, he could not have fathered this child. As many Ukrainian women were raped by German soldiers during the war, it has been speculated that Tatiana was conceived as a result of a rape committed by a German soldier. As Chikatilo and his mother lived in a one-room hut, this rape may have been committed in Chikatilo's presence. So you see what I mean? Just an absolutely horrific childhood. And once again, it doesn't excuse his monstrous deeds. But, looking back, it kind of makes sense. You're like, what the hell would make this kind of monster? Then you kind of look at his childhood, and it's kind of like, oh. I'm sure there are plenty of other people or families who underwent similar suffering and misery during the war and during the reign of Stalin. And, they didn't turn into cannibalistic serial killers. But obviously, this stuff must have had something to do with how Chikatilo became what he became. And so I don't want to read the entire Wikipedia page on Chikatilo, but basically as he got older, old enough to take interest in girls, it was revealed that he was painfully shy around the opposite sex, and that he seemed from a relatively young age to be incapable of achieving or maintaining an erection. And unfortunately, I don't think they had sildenafil yet. But anyway, who knows? It's always possible that there could have been a physiological cause for his impotence. But if I was to play armchair psychologist, my guess would be that you have someone who spent their formative years stuck in a one-room hut with their mother, in the same bed, and whose mother may have been raped in their presence, and the mother also berating him for the bedwetting and everything. It kind of makes sense that he may have developed some deep-seated issues regarding sex and relating to women. And his crimes were absolutely brutal. He would often make failed attempts to sexually assault his victims, and then would end up cutting them with a knife, partially eviscerating them, tearing pieces of their flesh away with his teeth, gouging out eyes, etc. I actually remember one of the things that stuck with me from that true crime show I had watched back in the day is that apparently he confessed that he liked to nibble on the uteruses of his victims and described them as being nice and pink and springy, and, describing how he would just throw them away or discard them when he was done nibbling on them. Yeah, this is probably the darkest episode I've ever done. We're really venturing into true crime territory. And I mentioned how I get kind of like disturbed and depressed by watching true crime stuff. And here I am turning around and inflicting it on my audience. But I guess journey we more into the nightmare. So many of his victims were women, but he also had adolescent victims, some of them as young as 12, including both girls and boys. He had actually been a teacher, and his initial crimes were basically him perving on his students, unwanted touching, groping, that kind of thing, and then eventually it escalated to murder. He abandoned his career as a teacher after multiple complaints of inappropriate touching, sexual assault, etc., and ended up taking on some kind of mundane job that required him to travel, and he planned his crimes around his travel schedule. Here's a bit from a psychological profile that was written up while he was still at large. The police had consulted a psychiatrist by the name of Alexander Bukanovsky, I think, or Bukanovsky. And so, yeah, it was a 65-page psychological profile, and it described the killer as a reclusive man aged between 45 and 50 years old who had endured a painful and isolated childhood and who was incapable of flirting or courtship with women. This individual was well educated, likely to be married and to have fathered children. And so I should mention that I think he did have at least one child, and I think it was his sister and her husband who had helped find him a wife. And Chicatilo wasn't able to consummate the marriage, so to speak. But, and I don't know if I should say it, it gets pretty graphic and crude, but his wife suggested that he basically masturbate and that he would use his fingers and instead of a turkey baster, use your imagination. This episode. But anyway, so the profile also suggested that the killer was a sadist who suffered from impotence and could achieve sexual arousal only by seeing his victims suffer. The murders themselves were an analog to the sexual intercourse this individual was incapable of performing, and his knife became a substitute for her penis, which failed to function normally. Because many of the killings had occurred on weekdays near mass transport hubs and across the entire Rostov Oblast, Bukanovsky, or however it's pronounced, also argued that the killer's work required him to travel regularly, and based upon the actual days of the week when the killings had occurred, the killer was most likely tied to a production schedule. I could probably spend another hour going over Chikatilo's story, not that I'd want to, but that's probably how long it would take, at least. So to bring his story to a close, he was eventually caught. Following the rejection of his appeal to the Supreme Court, Chikatilo filed a final appeal for clemency with President Boris Yeltsin. This final appeal was rejected on the 4th of January, 1994. On the 14th of February, Valentine's Day, 1994, Chikatilo was taken from his death row cell to a soundproofed room in Novocherkassk prison and executed with a single gunshot behind the right ear. He was buried in an unmarked grave at the prison cemetery. Seems about right. I know that might sound cold. Do we at least feel bad for the young boy that Chikatilo once was? I think so. It's horrible what that boy had to endure, and maybe if he had been handed a better, deck of cards or a better hand, so to speak, he might not have turned into the monster he became. But once that boy became a man and started to assault and savage and kill and take apart and consume other living human beings, that's when the sympathy ends, right? Obviously, are we on the same page? I mean, I suppose we could always have a philosophical conversation about free will. After everything that happened to him, the forces that shaped him, combined with his, genetic wiring, I guess. Could he have become anything else? Could he have made any other choices? Was he just too damaged to make the right choices by that point? I mean, I don't know. But either way, even if you wanted to be that charitable or whatever, or get that philosophical about it, end of the day, guy still has to be removed from society, at least. Whether or not the state should have the right to put him to death, that's a different conversation. So the good news is Chicatilo's now in our rearview mirror. The bad news is we still have to cover Albert Fish, and he might actually be worse than Chicatilo. And I'll just go on the record and say it. Yeah, I think Fish is definitely worse than Chicatilo. And I base that on the very young age of at least one of his victims. And it's that case that I'm thinking of that really disturbed me back in the day when I was watching that true crime show and first learned about Albert Fish. Yeah, I don't even know how to explain it. But when I think about what he did to this particular kid, this child, I get pissed. I want to like jump in a time machine, go back to, whenever, and kick the living shit out of Albert Fish. But for better or worse, we will eventually get to that story, but I'll start by reading a bit from, you guessed it, Wikipedia. So, Hamilton Howard, in quotes, Albert Fish. Let's see, he was born May 19th, 1870, died January 16th, 1936, was an American serial killer, child rapist, and cannibal. He was all, and like I said, these guys, despite how awful and wretched they are, they had some cool nicknames. Like, what was it? Chicatilo was the Red Ripper or whatever. So Fish was also known as the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, and the Brooklyn Vampire. Isn't that Eddie Murphy? Anyway, yeah, he was also known as the Moon Maniac and the Boogeyman. That last one wasn't really that creative. But Fish once boasted that he, and here it's in quotes, had children in every state, and at one time stated his number of victims was about 100. However, it is not known whether he was referring to rapes or cannibalization, nor is it known if the statement was truthful. Fish was a suspect in at least 5 murders during his lifetime. He confessed to 3 murders that police were able to trace to a known homicide, and he confessed to stabbing at least 2 other people. Fish was apprehended on December 13th, 1934, and put on trial for the kidnapping and murder of Grace Budd, and that's actually the case I was referring to. He was convicted and executed by electric chair on January 16th, 1936, at the age of 65. His crimes were dramatized in the 2007 film The Gray Man, starring Patrick, is it Bouchot or something like that? I think it's French, as Fish. I didn't even know that movie existed. I've never seen it. It's one of those things that, despite the fact that I like horror movies, I'm not sure if this one would just kind of depress me and gross me out. Maybe I'll watch it. I'm not sure. And it might be more of a psychological thriller than a horror movie, but same thing still applies. Anyway, so yeah, I mentioned that both Chicatilo and Fish had, horrific childhood. So I'll read a bit about Fish's. Albert Fish was born in Washington, D.C. on May 19th, 1870. Who cares whose parents were, blah, 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 blah. Fish's father was an American of English ancestry, and his mother was of Scots-Irish American. His father was 43 years old. Oh, this kind of is interesting. His father was 43 years older than his mother, and so 75 years old at the time of Fish's birth. Fish was the youngest child and had 3 living siblings, Walter, Annie, and Edwin. He wished to be known as Albert after a dead sibling, and to escape the nickname Ham and Eggs that he was given at an orphanage in which he spent much of his childhood. And so I remember when I was first reading this, that really kind of caught my attention, just that little thing that he wanted to be known by the name of a dead sibling. And my first assumption is that he felt some kind of tenderness or sentimentality towards that dead sibling. So to honor them, he wanted to, assume their name. And I was thinking how kind of incongruous that is with the seeming character of the adult fish and what an absolute monster, uh, you know, he had become. But yeah, that's interesting, though, that it seems like there was some kind of inkling of humanity there. But anyway, so Fish's family had a history of mental illness. His uncle suffered from mania. One of his brothers was confined in a state mental hospital, and his sister Annie was diagnosed with a quote unquote mental affliction. 3 other relatives were diagnosed with mental illnesses, and his mother had oral, not ORAL, but oral as in aura, and or visual hallucinations. And it just dawned on me, it's probably just a coincidence because the name Annie is so common. But Fish had a sister named Annie, and in Attack on Titan, one of the main or recurring characters is named Annie. It's not implausible seeing as there's that little Chicatilo and Fish Easter egg, in the show. But I have no evidence or whatever that that's where the name Annie came from. I like the Annie character, so I prefer it doesn't have anything to do with Albert Fish. I'm just thinking out loud. Who knows? But continues, Fish's father, Randall, was a riverboat captain and by 1870 a fertilizer manufacturer. The elder Fish died in 1875 at Washington 6th Street Station of a heart attack. The Congressional Cemetery records show that he died on October 16th, 1875, and was buried. Why do I care about this shit anyway? Fish's mother then put her son into St. John's Orphanage in Washington, where he was frequently abused. Fish began to enjoy the physical pain that the beatings brought. Of his time at the orphanage, Fish remarked, "I was there till I was nearly 9, and that's where I got started wrong. We were unmercifully whipped. I saw boys doing many things they should not have done." By 1880, Fish's mother had a government job and was able to remove Fish from the orphanage. In 1882, at age 12, he began a homosexual relationship with a telegraph boy. The youth introduced Fish to such practices as urolagnia, drinking urine, and I've never heard that one anyway. Coprophagia. I totally believe that there's people out there doing it. I just never heard the technical term for it. Yeah, and coprophagia, eating feces. Fish began visiting public baths where he could watch other boys undress, and spent a great portion of his weekends on these visits. Throughout his life, he would write obscene letters to women whose names he acquired from classified advertising and matrimonial agencies. Let's see, so it goes into his early adulthood. By 1890, at age 20, Fish arrived in New York City, and he said at that point he became a prostitute and began raping young boys. In 1898, his mother arranged a marriage for him with Anna Mary Hoffman, who was 9 years his junior. They had 6 children. Jeez, man. And one of them was named Albert. Imagine being, having to deal with that. No, I'm not that Albert Fish. That was just my dad. But so throughout, I gotta try to inject some levity here. This stuff is so heavy. Throughout 1898, Fish worked as a house painter. He said he continued... I feel like dirty, like just reading this crap. He said he continued molesting children, mostly boys younger than age 6. He later recounted an incident in which a male lover took him to a waxworks museum where Fish was fascinated by a bisection of a penis. After that, he became obsessed with sexual mutilation. In 1903, he was arrested for grand larceny, convicted and incarcerated in Sing Sing. And if I sound genuinely surprised by some of this stuff, I have to admit I did jump around a little when I was researching this, so some of this is hitting me for the first time too. And it just keeps getting just more and more crazy and depraved. Around 1910, while he was working in Wilmington, Delaware, Fish met a 19-year-old man named Thomas Kedden. He took Kedden to where he was staying, and the two began a sadomasochistic relationship. It is unclear whether or not Fish forced Kedden to do these things, but in his confession he implies that the man was intellectually disabled. After 10 days, Fish took Kedden to a quote-unquote an old farmhouse, where he began to torture him. The torture took place over 2 weeks. Fish eventually tied Kedden up and cut off half of his penis. And then here in quotes, "I shall never forget his scream or the look he gave me," Fish later recalled. He originally intended to kill Kedden, cut up his body and take it home, but he feared the hot weather would draw attention to him. Instead, Fish poured peroxide over the wound, wrapped it in a Vaseline-covered handkerchief, left a $10 bill, kissed Kedden goodbye, and left. And here in quotes, "Took first train I could get back home. Never heard what became of him or tried to find out," Fish said. Keep that story in mind next time you're using a dating app. Anyway, so in January 1917, Fish's wife left him for John Straub. I don't know who John Straub is, but it's got to be a step up. He can't be any worse than Fish. A handyman who boarded with the Fish family. Fish then had to raise his children as a single parent. Now, there's a sitcom premise. After his arrest, Fish told a newspaper that when his wife left him, she took nearly every possession the family owned. He began to have auditory hallucinations. He once wrapped himself in a carpet, saying that he was following the instructions of John the Apostle. Oh, and I remember reading this part before, and this is pretty wild. It was about this time that Fish began to indulge in self-harm. He would embed needles into his groin and abdomen. After his arrest, X-rays revealed that Fish had at least 29 needles lodged in his pelvic region. He also hit himself repeatedly with a nail-studded paddle and inserted wool doused with lighter fluid into his anus and set it alight. But before you judge, you gotta remember, they didn't have the internet back then, so what else are you gonna do for entertainment? Well, Fish was never thought to have physically attacked or abused his children. He did encourage them and their friends to paddle his buttocks with the same nail-studded paddle he used to abuse himself. He soon developed a growing obsession with cannibalism, often preparing himself a dinner consisting solely of raw meat and sometimes serving it to his children. Salmonella, anyone? With a side of E. coli? Anyway, so, let's see. Escalation. Oh, this should be good. In about 1919, Fish stabbed an intellectually disabled boy in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. He chose people who were either mentally handicapped or African American as his victims, explaining that he assumed these people would not be missed when killed. Fish would later claim to have occasionally paid boys to procure other children for him. Fish tortured, mutilated, and murdered young children with his quote-unquote implements of hell, a meat cleaver, a butcher knife, and a small handsaw. And so that phrase, implements of hell, that has stuck with me ever since I watched that true crime show about Albert Fish, narrated by Bill Curtis, whatever it was. I remember the name of the girl who he killed, that case that really stuck with me. Her name was Grace Budd. And I remember them saying in the show that he killed her with his so-called implements of hell. And that never left me. It was awful. And I didn't realize how many young kids he killed. I knew he was a serial killer, and I knew the horrific story about what he did to Grace Budd, but I didn't know there were so many other really young victims. And so, you're reading about all these horrible things that happen to kids, and it's in the past, so there's nothing you can do about it. But there's a couple of stories here where the kids get away. And it's kind of like you get a sigh of relief or some feeling of, take that, prick. Let's see. On July 11th, 1924, Fish found 8-year-old Beatrice Kyle playing alone on her parents' farm on Staten Island, New York. He offered her money to come and help him look for rhubarb. That seems like something that would happen in the 1920s. You don't hear that one anymore, really. Hey, come help me look for rhubarb, would you? I like to think of myself as a fairly intelligent person, but not only have I never eaten rhubarb, I don't even think I know what rhubarb looks like. I just looked it up. It kind of looks like lettuce on a stick. Anyway, so, Yeah, he offered her money to come and help him look for rhubarb. She was about to leave the farm when her mother chased Fish away. Good for you, Mom. Fish left, but returned later to the Keels, or I don't know how it's pronounced, Kiels, to their barn where he tried to sleep but was discovered by Beatrice's father and forced to leave. Too bad he didn't, curb stomp him. Anyway, 3 days later, Fish killed Frances McDonald, or McDonald, also on Staten Island. It doesn't say how old she is or anything. And so I just noticed that the name Frances McDonald, you could click on it, and I thought maybe it was going to take me to a different Wikipedia page, but it took me to another section within the Albert Fish page where it goes into more detail about Frances McDonald. And so according to this, Francis McDonald was a 9-year-old boy who had been reported missing by his parents after he failed to return home from playing catch with his friends. And he was found hanging from a tree. He had been strangled with his own suspenders. He had been assaulted both physically and otherwise, covered with lacerations. And it's so morbid. Most of the tissue or flesh was missing from one of his hamstrings. Apparently, Fish claimed that he was actually planning on castrating the boy, but fled when he heard someone approaching the area. And it says also during 1924, the 54-year-old Fish, suffering from psychosis, felt that God was commanding him to torture and sexually mutilate children. It's weird. I feel awful reading this stuff. I wonder what the people who, typed up the Wikipedia article or who have to, write articles about this, how they feel. And it kind of makes me wonder, who's writing these articles, But I don't know, it could be forensics experts or people who are really into criminology or true crime or whatever. And I don't mean to, cast aspersions at them or, imply anything about them, because I think they really are doing a service. Even if it's a disturbing topic, it's good to have these really informative encyclopedia-like entries about whatever the subject is, just as part of our collective repository, and it is good to have these kind of, what's the word? I guess criminal profiles or detailed, cases on record. Maybe they come in handy for, profilers, criminologists, forensic psychiatrists or whatever. And as disturbing as the stuff is, it's still part of our collective history or whatever, But I just wondered, psychologically, what's it like for the person writing or typing this stuff, just because it's so morbid and depraved and debased, sordid, depressing, whatever the adjectives are. But like I was saying, there's another story that offers a brief respite or, a fleeting bit of catharsis where the children or the child escapes. So it says, shortly before his abduction of Grace Budd, Fish attempted to test his quote-unquote implements of hell on a child, and here's where it gets rough again, a child he had been, I hate even saying this crap, maybe I'll just say diddling, I don't know, named Cyril Quinn. Quinn and his friend were playing box ball on a sidewalk when Fish asked them if they had eaten lunch. When they said that they had not, and this is why your parents tell you to be wary of strangers. When they said they had not, he invited them into his apartment for sandwiches. While the two boys were wrestling on Fish's bed, they dislodged his mattress. Underneath was a knife, a small handsaw, and a meat cleaver. They became frightened and ran out of the apartment. I wonder if those kids ever learned just how lucky they were, if they found out after the fact, maybe, when Fish was arrested or whatever. Holy crap. But on to the Grace Budd case. And so the only reason why I even remember who Albert Fish was is because I heard about the story of Grace Budd on that I think it was it Investigative Reports with Bill Curtis, whatever the name of the show was. And the story disturbed me and enraged me so much that it was just etched into my mind. And so I'll read from this section here pertaining to the murder of Grace Budd. On May 25th, 1928, Fish saw a classified advertisement in the Sunday edition of the New York World that read, "Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street." I feel weird reading that, like I'm doxing someone from more than half a century ago. Anyway, on May 28th, Fish, then 58 years old, visited the Budd family in Manhattan under the pretense of hiring Edward. He later confessed that he planned to tie Edward up, mutilate him, and leave him to bleed to death. Fish introduced himself as Frank Howard, a farmer from Farmingdale, that's creative, New York. He promised to hire Budd and his friend Willie. And I think if I'm not mistaken, Budd is actually Grace's older brother. But anyway, so he promised to hire Budd and his friend Willie and said he would send for them in a few days. Fish failed to show up, but he sent a telegram to the Budd family apologizing and set a later date. When Fish returned, he met Edward's younger sister, Grace Budd. He apparently changed his intended victim from Edward to Grace, and quickly made up a story about having to attend his niece's birthday party. And I can remember watching that episode, and when they were talking about this, it was almost like that thing, you know, when you're watching a horror movie and you wish you could yell to the character, "Don't go down the basement," or whatever, you know? Except this was real, and someone's child died because the parents weren't cautious enough. I'm not trying to blame the murder on the parents, but if they had just been a little more cautious, you know, and maybe it was a different time and people thought it was safer to let your kid go off with strangers, but apparently not, you know. I mean, Fish is the real monster here, but I can't help but to feel frustrated with the parents, even though this is an event that's, you know, decades and decades in the past now. But still. So yeah, he convinced the parents, Delia, Flanagan, and Albert Budd I, to let Grace accompany him to the party that evening. The elder Albert Budd was a porter for the United States Equitable Life Assurance Society. Grace had a younger sister, Beatrice, two older brothers, Edward and George, and a younger brother, Albert Budd II. Grace left with Fish that day, but never returned. The police arrested 66-year-old Superintendent Charles Edward Pope on September 5, 1930, as a suspect in Grace's disappearance. Accused by Pope's estranged wife, he spent 108 days in jail between his arrest and trial on December 22nd of 1930. He was found not guilty. And so this is the most disturbing part of all this. The break in the case came when Fish sent an anonymous letter to Grace's mother. And it was so detailed that it led the police back to Fish. But it really is like something out of a movie. I mean, Hannibal Lecter, even though he's a fictional character, to his credit, he wasn't a child killer. You know, but the kind of malicious intelligence with which the letter is written kind of makes me think of like a Hannibal Lecter or some other diabolical killer from a movie, you know, writing taunting but well-worded notes carefully crafted off to the police or their victims' families or something like that. And so once again, you know, this wasn't a movie, this was real life. And because I loathe Fish so much, I hate giving him credit, but judging by the letter, you know, he comes off as quite intelligent and literate and well-spoken, or having crafted a letter that is well-worded, very well-worded, which makes the note and the information it conveys, you know, that much more horrible. And my assumption was always that sending the letter was meant to be a sadistic gesture. That he wanted to reel the mother in with his long meandering letter, while gradually revealing to her the full horror of his crime, and in gruesome detail letting her know how horrible her daughter's final moments had been. But after reading more about Albert Fish and taking into consideration things like the religious delusions, the hallucinations, rolling himself up in a carpet and, yammering on about John the Apostle, I wondered if, part of me was wondering, well, did he really know how sadistic he was being? Was he just so zoned out and, mentally off that he thought he was just sending correspondence to let the mother know what happened to her kid? But no, when you look at the nature of his crimes, how well worded the letter was, how it really did seem, the letter seems to be dripping with sadistic joy, like he was savoring. That's why the letter was so long. He was savoring the pain he would be inflicting on the mother with the letter. So no matter how crazy he may have been, his auditory hallucinations, whatever they were, he still, at the end of the day, was a sadomasochist, and he enjoyed inflicting pain on others. And I won't read the letter in its entirety for two reasons. One, because some of it is just so graphic and despicable, and the other reason simply because it's too damn long. But I'll skip around and read some of it. So it starts with, "My dear Mrs." And this is another thing. I guess Grace's mother was illiterate, so her son had to read it to her. And so it starts, "My dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Captain John Davis." And I don't think it's ever been verified that Fish actually had a friend by the name of John Davis, who had sailed on the Tacoma and all that. But anyway, they sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and two others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At the time, there was a famine in China. Meat of any kind was from $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor that all children under 12 were sold to the butchers to be cut up and sold for food in order to keep others from starving. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street. You could go into any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. I think I may have, you can go in any shop. All right, yeah. Part of the naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out and just what you wanted cut from it. A boy or girl's behind, which is the sweetest part of the body and sold as veal cutlet, brought the highest price. John stayed there so long he acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to New York, he stole 2 boys, 1 7, 1 11, took them to his home, stripped them naked, tied them in a closet, and then burned everything they had. And so he goes on in this way, almost as if, like I was saying, like he's trying to make the mother's realization of what happened to her child really slowly and horribly, wash over her and sink in. And so, like I already touched on, I don't think it's ever been verified whether or not there really was a Captain John Davis, or if he, really acquired a taste for human flesh while in China and then came home and became an active cannibal here. It's not impossible. There really was widespread famine and even widespread reports of cannibalism during the Great Leap Forward and all that. But you can't help but still feel like it's a little outlandish, like the sailor came home and was cannibalizing children. But then again, Albert Fish actually was cannibalizing children. So And he goes into detail about how this sailor friend of his, in graphic detail about how he cut up and prepared the bodies, etc. And so he's building a narrative here, slowly revealing, what he did to her child. And so he shifts the focus from his sailor friend to himself. And he says, at the time I was living at 409 East 100th Street. So I just doxed Albert Fish. But hey, he deserves it. And rare, right side. Well, that's specific. He told me so often how good human flesh was, I made up my mind to taste it. On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street, brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch, so you see what he's doing here. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her on the pretense of taking her to a party. You said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester. And so he specifies that it was an empty house he had already picked out. And he goes on to say, when we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wild flowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. And I remember, this is a part that really chilled me, when I first watched that episode. Because just the idea of this little girl all of a sudden realizing she's not at home anymore, she's not with her parents, and all of a sudden there's this naked old man in front of her, how terrified she must have been. Yeah, it says, when all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run down the stairs. I grabbed her, and she said she would tell her mama. First, he stripped her, went on to say, how she kicked and bit. He goes on to say that he choked her to death, goes on to say how he cut her up, how in detail he prepared the different parts of her body, and almost like he deserves credit for his restraint, he lets the mother know in a very vulgar way that he could have had sex with her, but he didn't. Yeah, and ends the letter with, she died a virgin. So Albert Fish, possibly the biggest piece of shit in the universe. And if any good comes out of this, hopefully at least it'll be a reminder to parents that there really are human monsters out there in the world that you need to protect your children from. Don't let your little kids go off with strange old men. Holy shit, man. I decided to do this episode. I was hoping it would be relatively short and it would have appeal not only to my regular listeners, but to maybe Attack on Titan fans and whatnot. But like most of my content recently, this has been so long-winded. I don't know if a, Attack on Titan fan who doesn't know me from Adam is going to, watch this for. I might take the Attack on Titan part and make it its own separate episode where I talk about, the relationship between Attack on Titan and Fish and Chicatilo. But that's still probably going to be at least an hour long. And I don't know if an anime fan who doesn't know anything about this show is going to have the patience for that. We'll see what happens. But man, am I tired. Yeah, even though this is unscripted, I've been recording it sporadically, and I just had my second COVID shot, so I've been feeling like I have the flu. And then on top of it, I just had a dental crown done. So I'm just glad this episode is finally over. As always, thanks everyone for listening. Until next time. And I hope I didn't traumatize you too much with this one.